the Parshat of Deuteronomy, and a little bit about the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim. As we've kind of already talked about, Deuteronomy is really most famous for being a book of recapitulation. The English name, Deuteronomy, is actually not English. It derives from the Greek, and it corresponds to a Hebrew nickname for the book. The book is also known not just as the book of Dvarim, the book of things or the book of words, it's also known as Mishneh Torah, the second Torah, or the repetition of the Torah. Perhaps not surprisingly, that is both oversimplified and not totally accurate. While there is some review and repetition, there's also plenty of brand new content. By some counts, about 2/3 of the laws and commandments that appear in the book of Deuteronomy don't appear anywhere else in the Torah. And even though we get lots of references to the events of the Exodus from Egypt and the journey through the wilderness, and even a reference by name in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we never actually retell their stories. That makes me wonder what, if anything, this second generation coming out of Egypt actually knew of their forefathers and foremothers. Were the stories that are so deeply ingrained as part of our own heritage even familiar to them? Of course, Moses is recapping the story of Moses. This is his last grand stage after 40 years. And in many ways, even the great figures of the book of Genesis, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah and Rachel, Bilhah and Zilpah and all their kids, all of these figures are in many ways secondary to Moses' own story and history. And even if these stories of Genesis are secondary, they're not wholly absent. This morning, as part of our Torah reading, we read references to the descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother, and the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Names we haven't heard in months, and names that we would have assumed were left way back behind in the book of Genesis. And not only are they referenced, they're referenced in a way that stands out, especially in light of the commonly held idea that Jews are a chosen people, and possibly the only chosen people of the one and only chosen God, a main theme of the book of Deuteronomy. In chapter 2, verses 5 and 9, Moses recounts God telling him that in their campaign to conquer and enter the land, the Israelites must not harass either the Edomites descended from Esau, nor the Moabites descended from Lot. Despite the fact that both of these people will be trembling in fear before their cousins and their God, both nations are, to quote the verses, living in lands that God has assigned to them. Moses, at the very beginning of this speech that will be his final legacy, is introducing very important nuance to the developing mentality of this new generation. They will be powerful conquerors, without a doubt. People will fear them. But there are also limits to that identity and to that power. Even though this is late in the stage of the narrative of the Torah, it's still a preliminary stage in what will be the lasting kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And even from this early stage, it's evident that the Israelites' fate, from Moses' perspective and from God's, is not to be an empire. They will enter the land of Israel and they will conquer it. But they're not to take over all of the land in the world or fight with all of the nations. They will be a sovereign people, but they are also meant to be good neighbors, establishing peaceful relations, asking for permission to cross the territory of others, and paying for food and water. not just taking advantage of the fear they inspire and taking what they want for themselves. According to Nechama Leibowitz, the great Israeli Torah scholar of the 20th century, the new generation, full of their own strength and vigor, had to learn to practice self-control and curb their own aggressiveness, aroused by the very fear displayed by their weaker neighbors. And why do they need to display that self-control? What is it about these very neighbors? Even if Moses doesn't give the story of Genesis a full recount here, the Israelites are still bound by the history of Genesis. Family will always be family, even if, like Lot and Esau, they choose paths that we don't approve of or make decisions that are very different than our own. Lot chose to separate from Abraham, but God will continue to honor the close relationship they shared. Esau, at points, may have wanted to kill his brother Jacob, but he was still Isaac's favored son and was promised land and a nation. Those bonds are not erased, certainly not in God's eyes, and therefore neither in the eyes of the Israelites. In the coming weeks, we'll read a recapitulation of the Ten Commandments, which begins famously with, "I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. You shall have no other God beside me." Soon after that, we'll finally read the powerful words of the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Elohecha, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is your God, Adonai is one. There's a development and focus on the singularity of God, but not, paradoxically, on the singularity of the chosen people. The challenge that's posed here to the Israelites, and really to all their Jewish descendants looking forward, is how to live amongst the nations, and how to have a relationship with the divine amidst the other peoples of the world. I find these questions to be especially pertinent on the eve of Tisha B'Av, tonight's observance of historical communal tragedy, centered on the destruction of the two temples in Jerusalem. The story of Deuteronomy is one full of hope and destiny, a proud and strong nation on the move. The story after that, well, it's a story of a small and often politically and militarily weak people, living amongst or under the rule of Philistines, Canaanites, Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, Spaniards, the list goes on and on. Rabbi Ismar Shorsh, the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, writes about the contemporary observance of Tisha B'Av, far, far in the future from the events of this morning's Parsha. He writes that our observance reflect the fundamental reality of Jewish existence, that exile is not a geographic location, but an existential truth. Indeed, the state of homelessness is an ever-present danger to any and all illusions of power, permanence, and impregnability. I think that Moses knew that same message and strove to teach his people in his last days, as they marched towards their own seat of power, that even with God on their side, power, permanence, and impregnability